The sound of stones against bone is distinct. It is a dull, heavy thud that breaks the chest and tears the skin. I was standing there, in the dust of Jerusalem, watching the stones rise and fall. He was young, this Stephen. In the midday heat, his face shone with a cold, terrifying light, like a messenger from the Holy of Holies. And when they dragged him outside the wall, and the crowd went wild with fury, I did not throw a single stone. I was too important for that. I was the brilliant student of Gamaliel, the rising star of the Pharisees. I stood by the pile of outer garments, keeping watch over the cloaks. I felt the righteous satisfaction of a man cleaning the temple of God. Stephen looked up at the sky, his chest crushed, and he did not scream. He asked that this sin not be held against them. I smiled at his madness. I was Saul of Tarsus, and that day, I believed I had done God a service. Decades later, in a cold Roman prison, my back mapped with scars, and my eyes failing in the dark, I still saw his face. My name was Saul, and I was a murderer who found himself hunted by the very love I tried to destroy.
The city of Tarsus sat in the shadow of the Taurus Mountains, where the cold mountain water of the Cydnus River cut through the fertile plains of Cilicia. It was a bustling metropolis, a place where East met West under the heavy hand of Roman administration. Greek philosophers debated in the public squares, Roman soldiers marched along the paved streets, and merchants from every corner of the Mediterranean traded silk, spices, and the local fabric known as cilicium. This coarse cloth, woven from the stiff black hair of mountain goats, was the lifeblood of the city's trade, used for tents, cloaks, and sacks. The young Saul grew up walking streets where the smells of roasted meats, cedar wood, and wet animal hair mingled in the Mediterranean heat. He was a son of this city, born into a family of substantial means that possessed the rare and coveted privilege of Roman citizenship. Yet, he was not of Tarsus. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews, a child of the tribe of Benjamin, raised in the strict observance of the ancestral laws. His family looked past the pagan altars and the Greek gymnasiums, keeping their eyes fixed on the distant hills of Judea. The young Saul was taught to speak Greek, the language of commerce and philosophy, but his heart was shaped by the ancient Hebrew of the scriptures. He was a child of two worlds, yet completely devoted to one. The name Shaul carried the weight of nationalistic expectations. Named after the first king of Israel, who was also of the tribe of Benjamin, Saul was raised to be a warrior of the covenant. His family was Pharisaic, representing the most orthodox and rigorous faction of Judaism. They did not compromise with Hellenistic culture. They did not bow to Roman sensibilities. In their home, the law of Moses was the absolute center of gravity, a sacred boundary that separated the clean from the unclean, the righteous from the sinner. Saul watched the Greek citizens of Tarsus frequent the gymnasiums and the theaters, and he felt a growing detachment from their world. He was taught that Israel's exile under Roman rule was the direct consequence of disobedience. The only path to restoration, the only way to summon the Messiah and break the foreign yoke, was a total, uncompromising devotion to the Torah. Every ritual washing, every dietary restriction, and every Sabbath boundary was a battle line in a quiet war for the soul of his nation. The young boy from Cilicia internalized this struggle, his mind developing a sharp, analytical focus that would soon become his defining characteristic. When the time came for his education to deepen, his family sent him to Jerusalem, the beating heart of Israel's faith. The city of stone and sanctuary was dominated by the temple, whose white marble and gold leaf caught the morning sun like a mountain of fire. Saul entered the school of Gamaliel, the grandson of Hillel, one of the most respected rabbinic minds in the history of Judaism. Gamaliel was known for his moderation, his intellectual breadth, and his balanced approach to the law. He taught his students to consider the practical realities of life, to avoid extreme fanaticism, and to seek peace within the community. But the young student from Tarsus did not inherit his teacher's moderation. Saul possessed a mind like a razor and a heart that burned with a fierce, uncompromising fire. He mastered the complex arguments of the oral law, memorized the vast genealogies of the scriptures, and studied the prophets with an intensity that startled his peers. He became a Pharisee, part of the intellectual and spiritual elite of the nation, dedicated to keeping the covenant in its absolute purity. For Saul, the law of Moses was not a set of rules, it was the boundary of life and death. If Israel kept the law perfectly for a single day, the Messiah would come. If they tolerated disobedience, the covenant would shatter, and God's wrath would remain upon the land. This conviction was the foundation of his life, and it made him dangerous. When a new movement began to whisper through the narrow alleys of Jerusalem, speaking of a crucified carpenter from Galilee who had risen from the dead, Saul did not see a harmless sect. He saw a spiritual plague. A man hung on a tree was cursed by God, according to the Torah. To claim that a cursed criminal was the Messiah of Israel was the ultimate blasphemy, a pollution that threatened to destroy the fragile peace of the nation and invite divine judgment. Saul saw the followers of the Nazarene gathering in the temple courts, speaking of their master's resurrection, and he felt a cold, righteous anger. The scriptures provided a clear precedent for how a true servant of God must respond to heresy. He remembered Phinehas, the priest who had driven a spear through an apostate Israelite and a pagan woman, stopping a plague and securing God's covenant of peace. He remembered Elijah, who had slaughtered the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel to purge the land of false worship. In the ancient Hebrew mind, the word for this was zelos, a burning, protective jealousy for God's honor. Saul believed he was the heir to that jealousy. His violence was not born of malice. It was born of a terrifying, absolute righteousness. The young Pharisee felt the weight of Israel's destiny on his shoulders. He saw the Roman legions patrolling the temple fortress, their shields bearing the pagan eagle, and he believed that the presence of the Nazarene sect was the reason God did not intervene to deliver his people. The followers of Jesus were claiming that the temple sacrifices were no longer necessary, that the boundary between Jew and Gentile was collapsing, and that the temple itself would be destroyed. To Saul, this was not just error, it was treason against the covenant. It was a cancer that had to be cut out before it consumed the entire body of Israel. He went to the high priest, demanding letters of authority to expand the purge. He was not a bureaucrat signing papers, he was a crusade leader. He believed that every arrest, every public beating, and every stone cast was an act of worship that pleased the Creator. His conscience was perfectly clear, his resolve hardened by the scriptures he had memorized under Gamaliel. He was the defender of the law, the protector of the temple, the clean blade of Israel's survival. With letters of authority from the high priest, Saul began his campaign to eradicate the heretics. He did not watch from a distance. He led the temple guards into the narrow stone houses of Jerusalem, breaking through doors in the middle of the night, dragging men and women out into the cold streets. He watched the panic in the eyes of fathers, heard the cries of mothers, and felt no pity. Pity was a temptation to compromise. He brought them before the synagogues, demanding that they blaspheme the name of Jesus, using the threat of the lash and the prison cell to break their resolve. The air in those stone chambers was thick with the smell of sweat, oil lamps, and the blood of those who refused to recant. Saul stood there, his face hard, his voice flat, directing the punishments with the precision of a scholar administering a trial. When the council condemned Stephen to death, Saul did not throw a stone, but his presence was the authority that made the execution possible. He was the guardian of the garments, the witness who approved of the blood. The death of the young Greek-speaking Jew did not satisfy him. It only whetted his appetite for the purge. The heretics had fled Jerusalem, scattering to the north and the coast, carrying their plague with them. Saul resolved to follow. He rode unaware that his journey led to personal destruction rather than victory. The road to Damascus was long, stretching over 200 kilometers of rugged terrain, crossing the Jordan Valley and climbing into the dry plateaus of Syria. It was a journey of several days, a time of dust and silence under a burning sun. Saul rode at the head of his small retinue, his mind fixed on his mission, the letters from the high priest tucked safely into his belt. He was going to the foreign synagogues of Damascus to arrest any who belonged to the way and bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. He was at the height of his power, a young Pharisee who had turned his intellectual brilliance into a weapon of state, convinced that every mile he traveled brought Israel closer to redemption. The wind blew hot off the eastern deserts, parching the throat and stinging the eyes, but Saul felt only the cool certainty of his purpose. He was the spear of Phinehas, the fire of Elijah, the clean blade of the law. He did not know that the road he was traveling was a long corridor toward his own destruction. The zeal that carried him north was about to collide with the very presence he believed he was defending. The Syrian sun had reached its zenith, casting a white, blinding glare over the dry earth as the towers of Damascus appeared on the horizon. The heat was a heavy weight, forcing travelers to cover their faces and ride in silence. The air was dry and thin, and the dust kicked up by the horses' hooves hung suspended in the still atmosphere. Saul was focused, his eyes fixed on the city walls, counting the hours until he could begin the arrests. Then, in an instant, the daylight was swallowed by something else. A light from heaven, brighter than the midday sun, burst around Saul and his companions, flashing with a sudden, silent intensity that struck them all to the ground. The earth was hard and hot against Saul's face as he fell from his mount, the breath knocked from his lungs. The impact was violent, the dust rising in a cloud around him. In the blindness of that light, the silence broke. A voice spoke to him in the ancient Aramaic of his fathers, a voice that did not thunder from a mountain, but spoke directly into the center of his chest. "Shaul, Shaul, why do you persecute me?" The young Pharisee, his face in the dust, his hands trembling, asked the only question his brilliant mind could produce in the ruins of his certainty. "Who are you, Lord?" The answer came back, quiet and crushing. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." That single sentence shattered the mirror of Saul's life. For years, he had built an identity on the belief that he was the ultimate protector of God's honor. He had looked at the followers of the Nazarene and seen enemies of the covenant. Now, in the dust of the road, he discovered the terrifying truth. The crucified carpenter, whom the law declared cursed, was alive, clothed in the glory of the heavens. And in his zeal to defend God, Saul had been waging war against him. Every stone thrown, every family dragged from their home, every blow struck against the weak had been directed at the Lord of glory himself. The psychology of his righteousness was exposed as a massive, violent delusion. The light did not destroy him with fire, it did something worse. It left him in absolute darkness. When Saul rose from the ground and opened his eyes, he saw nothing. The brilliant scholar who had guided the Sanhedrin, who had read the ancient scrolls with such precision, was now blind, unable to see the hands of his companions or the road before his feet. His eyes were wide open, but the world had vanished. They took him by the hand and led him into Damascus, through the eastern gate and down the long street called Straight. The Via Recta was the monumental axis of Roman Damascus, a grand avenue lined with imposing columns that cut through the city from east to west. It was a place of constant noise, filled with the shouts of metal workers, the braying of donkeys, and the smells of street food. But to Saul, the columns and the crowds were gone, replaced by a silent, terrifying void. The proud Pharisee who had intended to enter the city as a conqueror bringing heretics in chains was led like a child, his head bowed, his steps hesitant on the stone pavement. He had to trust the hands of the very men he had commanded. They brought him to the house of a man named Judas, and there, in a small dark back room away from the busy street, Saul remained for 3 days. He did not eat. He did not drink. He sat in the silence of his blindness, his mind working in the darkness. It was a period of psychological death, a complete dismantling of the ego. In those 72 hours, Saul had to rebuild his entire world from the ruins. Every scripture he had memorized had to be reread in the light of the resurrection. He faced the reality that the cross was the victory of God, erasing the curse of a criminal. The faces of those he had persecuted, the face of Stephen looking at the sky, must have returned to him in the dark, no longer as heretics, but as witnesses to a truth he had been too blind to see. He was the persecutor, the murderer, the enemy of the very hope he had prayed for. The weight of his guilt was a heavy, suffocating blanket in the silent room. The darkness of those 3 days was a crucible. Saul had defined himself by his actions, his credentials, and his superior knowledge. In the dark, all of those things were stripped away. He could not perform. He could not study. He could not defend himself. He was reduced to an absolute, terrifying vulnerability. The silence was a mirror that showed him the true nature of his zeal. He had defended his own need for control, his own spiritual pride, and his own tribal security, rather than the honor of God. The violence he had unleashed was the external expression of an internal insecurity that could not tolerate the existence of a different hope. The 3 days without food or water were a physical fasting that mirrored the spiritual starvation of his soul. He had to die to the name Saul, to the warrior king who took what he wanted by force before he could receive a new life. He was waiting in the dark for a judgment he knew he deserved, realizing that his righteousness was nothing but filthy rags in the presence of the true light. While Saul sat in his darkness, a man named Ananias was praying in another part of the city. Ananias was a quiet follower of the way, a man who had heard of the terror Saul had unleashed in Jerusalem and the authority he carried to Damascus. He knew that the name of Saul of Tarsus meant prison, beatings, and death for people like him. When the Lord spoke to him in a vision, telling him to go to the house of Judas and ask for a man of Tarsus named Saul, Ananias resisted. He argued. He pointed to the reports of the high priest's letters. He knew the danger of stepping into the room of a wounded predator, but the voice in the vision was clear. Go, for he is a skeuos eklogis, a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. The term chosen instrument did not suggest a clean, honorable vessel, but a simple jar of clay molded for a specific, difficult purpose, destined to be chipped and broken in the master's service. Ananias arose, walked through the narrow streets of the city, and entered the house of Judas. He found the room where the blind Pharisee sat in the dark. Ananias did not curse him. He did not demand an apology. He laid his hands on Saul's shoulders and spoke a word that must have shattered what was left of Saul's pride. Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. At the touch of Ananias's hands, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he regained his sight. The first face he saw in the light was the face of one of the men he had come to arrest, a face that looked at him not with hatred or fear, but with the quiet affection of a brother. Ananias did not require a public confession or a long penance. He simply welcomed him into the family of God. Saul arose, was immersed in the waters of baptism, and took food, and his strength returned. The waters of Damascus did not wash away a simple error. They buried a lifestyle of religious violence. The Pharisee was dead, the apostle was born, but the transition was not easy. The community in Damascus was suspicious. The authorities in Jerusalem felt betrayed, and Saul found himself isolated, caught between the world he had abandoned and the world that did not yet trust him. He went away into the desert of Arabia, spending 3 years in the silence of the wilderness, letting the revelations settle into his bones, preparing for a life that would be defined not by the power of the law, but by the scandal of the cross. He had been broken by grace, and the man who emerged from the desert was no longer Saul the destroyer, but Paul the servant, a man who knew that his only boast was the mercy that had found him in the dust. The man who returned from the Arabian desert was different. He had dropped the name Saul, the name of the towering king who had lost his mind to jealousy, and took the name Paul, the Latin word for small, little, insignificant. The name functioned as a daily reality rather than a theological title. Paul did not travel with the prestige of the Jerusalem elite. He traveled as a poor artisan, settling in the crowded, dirty quarters of Ephesus, Corinth, and Thessalonica, where the smell of tanning leather and animal grease was thick in the air. He worked with his hands, his fingers cut and blackened by the rough silicium fibers and the sharp needles used to mend tents. He worked during the hot hours of the day, his back aching, earning enough to pay for his bread and to avoid being a burden to the small communities he founded. The brilliant scholar who had sat at the feet of Gamaliel was now a manual laborer, his hands calloused, his body smelling of sweat and leather, explaining the scriptures to dock workers, slaves, and prostitutes in the evening hours after the shops closed. In cities like Ephesus, the grand metropolis of Artemis, he was seen not as a scholar, but as a second-class laborer, working in a dark, noisy workshop, his message dismissed by the intellectual elite as foolishness. The dust of the workshop settled in his lungs, and the heavy iron needles left permanent scars on his thumbs, a constant reminder of his social descent. His body became a map of the message he preached. The violence he had once directed against others was now directed against him. 5 times he stood before the rulers of the synagogues and received the 39 lashes, the leather whips tearing the flesh of his back, leaving thick, jagged scars that would never heal. The pain of those lashes was a slow, burning fire that made sleep impossible for days, the wounds reopening with every movement of his shoulders. 3 times he was beaten with the iron rods of the Roman magistrates, his bones bruised, his joints swollen. Once, in the city of Lystra, a mob dragged him outside the gates and stoned him, leaving him on the dirt road for dead, his head bleeding, his body covered in bruises. 3 times he was shipwrecked, spending a night and a day drifting on the open sea, clinging to a piece of broken wood in the cold Mediterranean water. He knew hunger, thirst, cold, and exposure. He walked thousands of miles on foot across the rugged roads of the empire, climbing the dangerous mountain passes of the Taurus where bandit gangs hid in the clefts of the rocks, waiting to rob unprotected travelers. He crossed swollen rivers, slept in damp, drafty inns, and felt the slow decay of his physical frame. The scars on his body served as the physical receipts of his apostolate instead of badges of honor. When he wrote to the Galatians, he did not point to his credentials or his learning. He simply wrote, "I bear on my body the marks of Jesus." The marks were the brandings of a slave, showing who owned him. But the deepest pain was not the whip or the stone. It was the torment he carried inside. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul spoke of a skolops tisarchi, a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan sent to harass him to keep him from becoming conceited. The Greek word skolops referred to a sharp wooden stake used for torture or barrier defense rather than a small splinter. It was a sharp, constant, agonizing pain. Scholars have debated for centuries what this thorn was. Some suggest it was a chronic eye disease, a legacy of the blinding light of Damascus, pointing to his letters where he notes that he writes with large characters, or that the Galatians would have torn out their own eyes to give them to him. Others suggest it was malaria, epilepsy, or a speech impediment that made his presence weak and his speech of no account. Whatever it was humiliating. Paul, the man who had laid hands on the sick and seen them recover, the man who had commanded a dead boy to rise and saw him breathe, was powerless to cure himself. He begged the Lord 3 times for the stake to be removed. The answer he received defined grace instead of offering a cure. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." The stake remained, a physical anchor that kept the brilliant mind of the Pharisee bound to the humility of the cross, preventing him from soaring into the clouds of his own self-importance. This was the hardest lesson for the former Pharisee. Saul had lived by the power of his own righteousness, his own intellect, his own zeal. Paul had to live by the sufficiency of a grace that kept him weak. He had to accept that his physical infirmities, his failing eyes, his trembling hands, and his weak presence were the very chambers where the power of Christ was put on display. The genius of Tarsus had to become small so that the cross could look large. This tension marked his entire ministry. He traveled the Roman roads, walking thousands of miles on foot, crossing high mountain passes like the Taurus where bandit gangs lay in wait for unprotected travelers. He crossed flooded rivers, slept in cold stone inns, and felt the slow decay of his physical frame under the weight of his journeys. He was a man in constant motion, yet always bound to his own weakness. He clashed with the pillars of the church in Jerusalem, accusing Peter of hypocrisy to his face in Antioch when Peter withdrew from Gentile tables out of fear of the circumcision party. He stood alone against the pressure of traditionalism, arguing that the grace of God could not be confined to Jewish customs. He split with Barnabas, his closest companion, over the desertion of John Mark, refusing to compromise the mission for the sake of friendship. He was a difficult man, intense, demanding, bearing the sharp edges of a personality that had never lost its fire, but had only changed its fuel. He was loved by many, hated by more, and understood by very few. The emotional burden of his work was a heavy, constant pressure. Beyond the physical hardships and the state persecution, he carried what he called the daily pressure of his concern for all the churches. He watched the communities he had founded with such pain tear themselves apart with division, falling back into the safety of the law or collapsing into moral chaos. He wrote to them from his prison cells, his letters filled with a passionate, desperate love, pleading with them to remain true to the gospel of grace. The ink was cheap, the parchment was rough, and his eyes often failed him in the dim light of his confinement, forcing him to dictate his thoughts to a scribe. But the words carried the pulse of a man who had looked into the empty eyes of his own victims and found there the mercy of God. He did not speak of his achievements. He spoke of Christ and him crucified. The scholar who had known everything had learned to count it all as loss, refuse, dung, for the sake of knowing the one who had stopped him on the road. The grace he preached, manifested as the blood on his back and the pain in his chest, transformed into a song of victory rather than a theological theory. It was the realization that the same God who had knocked him down in the dust had also lifted him up, serving as the chief of sinners who had been redeemed by an unimaginable love instead of reigning as an earthly ruler. He knew the cost of his calling. The road he traveled was a long journey toward his own execution, but he did not turn back. The fire that had once driven him to destroy the church now drove him to build it, not with weapons, choosing instead the vulnerability of a witness who had been conquered by love. The transition from Saul to Paul was a journey from the pride of a righteous persecutor to the humility of a broken servant. He had traded the authority of the high priest's letters for the chains of a Roman prisoner, and in those chains, he found a freedom that the empire could never understand. The scars on his back were the marks of his belonging, and the thorn in his flesh was the anchor that kept him close to the cross. He was small, he was weak, he was caved in by suffering, but in his weakness, the strength of the risen carpenter shone with a light that would outlast the stars. The road ended in Rome. In the damp dark of the Mamertine prison, the old apostle sat in chains, waiting for the executioner's sword. He had fought the good fight. He had kept the faith. The blade fell, and the head of Saul of Tarsus rolled into the Roman dirt. He had outlived the empire that killed him. To explore the raw, unvarnished psychology of biblical history, subscribe.